The first time people heard the name Nathaniel Cole, it was spoken with admiration. He was born into comfort in the heart of a bustling African city, the only son of wealthy parents who believed deeply in education, discipline, and legacy. His father, Richard Cole, was a respected businessman, while his mother, Margaret Cole, was known for her generosity and quiet strength. Their home stood tall behind iron gates, surrounded by flowering trees and the soft hum of generators during power cuts. Nathaniel grew up shielded from hardship. His childhood was filled with private tutors, weekend vacations, and conversations about the future that assumed success as a certainty. From an early age, his parents told him he was destined for greatness, not because of money, but because of the values they instilled in him. He listened, believed, and dreamed big dreams. Despite the privilege, Nathaniel was not arrogant. He had a gentle heart and an inquisitive mind. At school, teachers praised his intelligence and classmates admired his calm confidence. He loved books, debates, and long discussions about life. His parents watched him with pride, convinced their sacrifices had not been in vain. When Nathaniel gained admission into a prestigious university, it felt like the natural next step in a perfect journey. His parents celebrated quietly, already planning his future beyond graduation. None of them knew that fate was sharpening its blade, waiting for the right moment to strike. The call came on a rainy afternoon, the kind of rain that darkened the sky and soaked the earth without mercy. Nathaniel was in his hostel room, halfway through a lecture note, when his phone rang. The voice on the other end trembled as it spoke, and before the words were fully formed, his heart already knew something was wrong. His parents were gone. A fatal accident on the highway. No goodbyes. No final words. Nathaniel traveled home in silence, his mind refusing to accept reality. The house that once felt warm now echoed with grief. Neighbors filled the compound, crying and whispering prayers, but none of it reached him. He walked through the rooms like a ghost, touching familiar objects as if they belonged to another life. The burial passed like a blur. Black clothes, wailing relatives, and endless condolences. Nathaniel stood by the grave, staring as soil covered the coffins, feeling something deep inside him collapse. The world he knew had ended, and no one had taught him how to survive what came next. After the mourners left, the silence became unbearable. Night after night, he lay awake, replaying memories, blaming himself for being away at school, for not calling more often. Grief settled into his bones, heavy and unrelenting. Returning to university was harder than Nathaniel expected. The campus felt foreign, loud, and indifferent to his pain. Lectures continued, students laughed, and life moved forward as if nothing had happened. But inside him, everything had changed. Financial problems soon followed. Accounts were frozen. Business partners vanished. Legal complications swallowed what remained of his parents' wealth. Each visit home revealed more losses, more debts, more unanswered questions. The comfort he once took for granted dissolved slowly but surely. Nathaniel tried to focus on his studies, but his mind refused to cooperate. Pages blurred, lectures sounded distant, and exams became nightmares. He failed courses he once would have passed effortlessly. Shame joined grief, and with it came isolation. When the university administration called him in, the conversation was polite but firm. Outstanding fees had piled up. Extensions had expired. Without payment, he could not continue. Walking out of that office, Nathaniel felt something snap inside him. His future had been paused indefinitely. Dropping out wasn't a decision, it was a surrender. Back in the city, reality struck hard. Friends from his old life avoided him, unsure of how to relate to a fallen heir. The house grew emptier as possessions were sold off one by one. Nathaniel, once protected, now faced the world without armor. It was Kelvin who first offered an escape. Kelvin spoke fast, dressed sharp, and always had cash. He talked about online work, easy money, and beating a system that didn't care about honest men. At first, Nathaniel resisted. His parents' voices echoed in his head. But hunger has a way of silencing morals. Desperation pushed Nathaniel closer. He watched, learned, and eventually participated. Small wins turned into larger scores. Money returned, not as stability, but as temptation. He felt powerful again, admired again. Each success dulled the guilt. Each lie became easier. Nathaniel told himself it was temporary, just a bridge back to his dreams. He didn't notice how quickly the bridge was burning behind him. The money changed everything. New clothes. New phones. New friends. Nights became louder, longer, and darker. Nathaniel moved into circles where excess was normal and consequences were jokes told after midnight. Drugs entered his life subtly. First as laughter, then as relief. They quieted the thoughts that haunted him, numbed the pain he never addressed. What began as an escape soon became a dependency. Kelvin and the others pushed boundaries, taking bigger risks. Nathaniel felt uneasy but stayed silent. He didn't want to be weak. He didn't want to lose the only place he felt he belonged. Sleep became irregular. Paranoia crept in. He laughed too loudly, trusted too easily, and spent recklessly. The boy who once dreamed of honor and impact was slowly disappearing. And beneath the flashing lights and loud music, something dark was growing inside him, something that would soon demand a heavy price. Nathaniel began to notice the changes in himself before anyone else did. His hands sometimes shook for no clear reason, and his thoughts raced uncontrollably at night. Sleep became a luxury, not a routine. When he did sleep, nightmares chased him, visions of his parents calling his name from dark places he could never reach. The drugs no longer gave him peace, they only delayed his pain. What once made him feel invincible now left him anxious and irritable. Small disagreements turned into heated arguments, and laughter quickly dissolved into anger. The people around him blamed stress, but deep down, Nathaniel knew something was wrong. Kelvin dismissed his concerns. He laughed it off, telling him to man up and enjoy the money while it lasted. In that world, weakness was dangerous. So Nathaniel swallowed his fear and followed along, convincing himself that everyone felt this way sometimes. But the cracks widened. He began forgetting conversations, misplacing large sums of money, and suspecting betrayal where there was none. Paranoia crept into his mind like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. As their operations grew, so did the risks. Nathaniel found himself involved in deals he barely understood, trusting people he wouldn't have spoken to in his old life. The money came faster, but so did the danger. Every knock on the door made his heart race. Kelvin changed too. He became controlling, possessive, and secretive. He decided who was trustworthy and who wasn't, who stayed and who disappeared. Nathaniel noticed he was no longer a partner but a pawn. When Nathaniel questioned a suspicious deal, Kelvin's response was sharp and threatening. He reminded Nathaniel of what he knew, details that could ruin his life instantly. That was the moment Nathaniel realized he was trapped. Fear replaced excitement. Loyalty replaced reason. He continued, not because he wanted to, but because he felt he had no choice. The chains were no longer invisible. At night, Nathaniel stared at the ceiling, wondering how a boy raised with love had ended up afraid of the very people he called friends. The downfall didn't come all at once. It started quietly. One deal failed. Then another. Money vanished faster than it came. Accounts were drained, phones seized, and promises broken. Someone had talked. Someone had betrayed them. Kelvin disappeared without warning, leaving Nathaniel exposed. Calls went unanswered. Messages remained unread. The same man who dragged him into the darkness had abandoned him there. Creditors came knocking, not with paperwork, but with threats. Nathaniel sold what little he had left to survive. The luxury clothes, the gadgets, the illusion of success, all gone. Shame crushed him. He avoided old neighbors, crossed streets to avoid recognition, and stopped answering calls from relatives who still believed in him. The fall was public, and it was merciless. For the first time since his parents' death, Nathaniel cried uncontrollably, mourning not just what he lost, but who he had become. Without money or protection, Nathaniel's mental state worsened. He began hearing whispers at night, voices accusing him, mocking him, reminding him of every wrong decision he had made. He argued with people who weren't there and laughed at jokes no one told. Some days, he was unusually energetic, talking endlessly about grand plans that made no sense. Other days, he couldn't leave his bed, trapped in a fog of despair so thick it felt physical. Neighbors noticed. Rumors spread. He's not normal anymore, they said. The same people who once admired him now watched with pity or fear. Nathaniel tried to pray, but guilt blocked his words. He tried to remember who he used to be, but that version of himself felt like a stranger. His mind had become a battlefield, and he was losing. When he finally collapsed on the roadside one afternoon, shouting at invisible enemies, the city looked on and turned away. Nathaniel woke up in a small clinic, restrained to a bed. The smell of disinfectant filled his nostrils, and his head throbbed painfully. A nurse explained gently that he had been brought in after a public breakdown. For the first time in months, someone spoke to him with kindness. It confused him. He listened silently as the doctor explained his condition: substance-induced psychosis, severe depression, and trauma left untreated for too long. In that quiet room, fragments of his past returned. His mother's voice reminded him to breathe. His father's firm belief that no fall was final. Tears streamed down his face as regret hit him fully. He realized then that money had not ruined him, unhealed pain had. Every wrong turn traced back to grief he never confronted. As the sun rose through the clinic window, Nathaniel made a fragile promise to himself. If he survived this, he would try, truly try, to find his way back. Nathaniel's days at the clinic followed a strict routine. Medication in the morning, counseling sessions in the afternoon, silence at night. At first, he resisted it all. He hated the pills that made his head feel heavy and the questions that forced him to revisit memories he had buried deep. The therapist, Dr. Allen, was patient. He didn't judge Nathaniel or rush him. He listened as Nathaniel slowly opened up about his parents, the university, the money, and the friends who vanished. Each session peeled back layers of pain Nathaniel had never allowed himself to feel. Recovery was not a straight line. Some mornings, Nathaniel woke up hopeful, convinced he could rebuild his life. Other mornings, despair returned, whispering that it was too late. The weight of regret was heavy, but for the first time, he was not running from it. In the quiet moments, Nathaniel began to write. He filled notebooks with thoughts, apologies he would never send, and memories of who he once was. Writing became a mirror, painful, but honest. When Nathaniel was discharged from the clinic, reality welcomed him harshly. The neighborhood hadn't forgotten his breakdown. People stayed longer than necessary. Some crossed the road to avoid him. Others whispered his name with pity. Relatives offered advice but little understanding. Some told him to pray harder. Others blamed him entirely for his downfall. Very few asked how he truly felt. The loneliness returned, sharp and familiar. Nathaniel tried to find work, but his past followed him everywhere. Employers asked questions he couldn't answer without shame. Each rejection chipped away at the fragile confidence he was trying to rebuild. At night, temptation knocked loudly. Old numbers still lived in his phone. The promise of easy money whispered to him again. He stared at the screen many times, fingers trembling. Each time, he remembered the clinic bed, the restraints, the emptiness, and he put the phone down. The relapse came quietly, without drama. One bad day. One overwhelming memory. One drink to calm his nerves. Nathaniel told himself it was harmless, just once. But once became twice. Twice became routine. Within weeks, he felt the familiar fog returning. His sleep broke apart. His thoughts became scattered. Shame returned with full force, louder than before. He hated himself for falling again. This time, there was no Kelvin to blame, no bad friends to point at. The enemy was within him. The realization hurt more than anything else. One night, sitting alone in the dark, Nathaniel broke down completely. He cried not for his parents, not for the money, but for the strength he thought he had and lost again. Yet, beneath the tears, something else emerged: anger. Not destructive anger, but determination. He refused to die in the same place twice. Help came from an unexpected place. Mrs. Harper, an old family friend and former university lecturer, recognized Nathaniel one afternoon at a bus stop. She almost didn't. He looked thinner, older, and worn by life. They talked for hours. She listened without interruption as Nathaniel told his story from beginning to end. When he finished, expecting judgment, she surprised him with compassion. She reminded him of the brilliant student he once was, the essays that showed depth beyond his years. She told him education was not a door that closed forever. There were other paths, other chances. Mrs. Harper offered him a small job at a community learning center, nothing glamorous, just assisting with adult literacy classes. Nathaniel accepted immediately. For the first time in a long while, he felt useful. Teaching others to read and write grounded him. Their struggles reminded him that pain was universal, but so was hope. Slowly, Nathaniel rebuilt his life, not with grand gestures, but with consistency. He attended support meetings, stayed away from old environments, and committed himself to the work at the center. Progress was slow, but it was real. He began speaking to young people about his journey. Not as a warning filled with fear, but as a testimony of consequences and resilience. Some listened. Some didn't. But he spoke anyway. Nathaniel learned to forgive himself, not fully, but enough to move forward. He accepted that his scars were permanent, but they no longer defined him completely. Late one evening, as he closed the learning center, Nathaniel looked up at the sky. For the first time in years, it didn't feel heavy. It felt open. He wasn't the boy he used to be, but he was alive, aware, and walking forward. And that, he realized, was a victory. Even as Nathaniel's life stabilized, consequences from his past refused to disappear. Some debts could not be paid with apologies, and some names still caused doors to close when mentioned. There were days when he felt he was running uphill while carrying stones on his back. At the learning center, a few parents questioned his presence when they learned fragments of his history. Whispers followed him again, softer than before but still sharp. Nathaniel learned that redemption did not mean immediate acceptance. Instead of fighting the whispers, he embraced transparency. When asked, he told the truth, carefully, humbly, without excuses. Some people walked away. Others stayed. The ones who stayed mattered more. This honesty cost him comfort, but it gave him peace. For the first time, he was not pretending to be someone else. Just as life began to feel manageable, Kelvin resurfaced. The call came late at night. Same voice. Same confidence. Kelvin spoke as if nothing had happened, laughing about the past and boasting about new opportunities. He offered Nathaniel money, safety, and a fresh start, cleaner this time. Nathaniel's heart raced. The memory of easy cash stirred something dangerous inside him. For a moment, he imagined how quickly his problems could disappear. But then he remembered the clinic, the breakdown, the empty nights. He remembered who Kelvin truly was. Nathaniel ended the call without explanation. His hands shook afterward, and he sat in silence for a long time. Temptation had knocked, and for the first time, he had refused it completely. That night, he realized strength wasn't loud. It was quiet resistance. Months passed, and Nathaniel grew into his role at the learning center. Students trusted him. Some saw him as a brother, others as a mentor. Their progress became his reward. Mrs. Harper encouraged him to formalize his experience. With her help, Nathaniel applied for a distance learning program, using his past university credits. It wasn't easy. Studying while working stretched him thin, but he persisted. There were nights he nearly gave up, staring at textbooks with exhausted eyes. But each time, he reminded himself that this struggle was honest. No shortcuts. No lies. When he passed his first set of exams, he didn't celebrate loudly. He simply smiled to himself, knowing how far he had come. Healing did not erase Nathaniel's mental scars. There were still episodes, days when anxiety returned without warning, nights when sleep refused to come. The difference now was awareness. He sought help early, spoke openly, and adjusted when necessary. He learned that mental strength was not about endurance, but about care. One afternoon, while addressing a group of young men, Nathaniel noticed fear in their eyes, not of him, but of becoming like him. He told them something no one had told him years ago: pain ignored becomes poison. After the session, a boy approached him quietly and said, "Your story saved me." Nathaniel walked home that day with tears in his eyes. Purpose, he realized, was the antidote to despair. On the anniversary of his parents' death, Nathaniel visited their graves alone. He carried flowers and a folded letter he had written years earlier in the clinic. He read it out loud, every apology, every regret, every promise. His voice cracked, but he finished. The wind moved gently through the trees, and for a moment, he felt something close to peace. Nathaniel did not leave the letter behind. He folded it carefully and placed it back in his pocket. Some things were meant to be carried, not abandoned. As he walked away, he understood something clearly. His life was no longer about what he had lost, but about what he chose to build from the ruins. Nathaniel's growing stability attracted attention, both good and bad. Community leaders began inviting him to speak at youth programs, impressed by his honesty and calm presence. But with visibility came scrutiny. Old rumors resurfaced, twisted and exaggerated. One evening, an anonymous message arrived, threatening to expose his past publicly if he didn't pay a certain amount of money. Nathaniel stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the familiar surge of fear. His first instinct was to panic. Instead, he did something different. He reported the message and informed Mrs. Harper. He also prepared himself emotionally for whatever might come. He knew now that hiding only gave power to fear. When the threat never materialized, Nathaniel realized something important: the past only had power when he ran from it. Facing it stripped it of its teeth. A cousin Nathaniel hadn't spoken to in years showed up unexpectedly. Their relationship had been strained since the family wealth collapsed, poisoned by blame and resentment. The meeting was tense and awkward. The cousin accused Nathaniel of wasting everything their parents built. The words cut deep, reopening wounds Nathaniel thought had healed. For a moment, anger surged within him. But instead of reacting, Nathaniel listened. When it was his turn to speak, he admitted his mistakes without defending them. He spoke of grief, confusion, and choices made in darkness. The conversation ended without hugs or closure, but something shifted. Forgiveness, Nathaniel realized, was not about agreement. It was about releasing the burden of bitterness. Nathaniel's academic efforts finally bore fruit. He received confirmation that his distance learning program had accepted his transfer credits fully. He was officially back on the path he thought he'd lost forever. The news didn't make him shout or cry. He sat quietly, breathing deeply, absorbing the weight of the moment. It wasn't the university he first attended, but it didn't matter. That night, he celebrated by cooking a simple meal and journaling about how far he had come. The joy felt clean, undeserved by shortcuts. He understood then that redemption often arrived quietly, without fireworks, but with permanence. Over time, the learning center became more than a workplace. It became home. Colleagues trusted Nathaniel, students defended him, and the walls echoed with laughter and learning. During a community event, Nathaniel found himself surrounded by people who believed in him, not because of his past wealth or mistakes, but because of his consistency. The realization humbled him deeply. Mrs. Harper watched him from a distance that day, smiling proudly. She had not saved Nathaniel, she had simply believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. For the first time since losing his parents, Nathaniel felt part of a family again. One afternoon, Nathaniel was invited to speak at a university orientation program. Standing at the podium, he felt a strange mix of nerves and gratitude. Years ago, this environment had broken him. He told the students the truth, not a polished success story, but a warning wrapped in hope. He spoke about grief, choices, consequences, and the importance of asking for help early. As he finished, the room remained silent for a moment before applause filled the hall. Nathaniel stepped down, heart pounding, knowing he had faced one of his greatest fears. Walking out into the sunlight, he realized he was no longer running from his past. He was standing in it, stronger, wiser, and finally at peace. Nathaniel's growing influence did not go unnoticed. A non-profit organization focused on youth rehabilitation reached out, impressed by his story and community work. They offered him a leadership role, one that came with responsibility, visibility, and pressure. The offer frightened him. Leadership meant being seen, judged, and held accountable. It meant that any mistake could be magnified. Nathaniel worried about his mental health, his past, and whether he was truly ready. Mrs. Harper encouraged him gently, reminding him that fear was not a sign of weakness, but of awareness. She told him leadership was not about perfection, but about integrity. After days of reflection, Nathaniel accepted. He knew growth required discomfort. He promised himself he would not hide behind fear anymore. The new role brought Nathaniel face to face with young men who reminded him painfully of his former self. Some were angry, others desperate, and many deeply wounded. Their stories echoed his own. One boy, Ethan, resisted Nathaniel fiercely. He mocked him, questioned his credibility, and accused him of hypocrisy. Nathaniel saw through the anger to the pain beneath it. Instead of pushing Ethan away, Nathaniel stayed patient. He listened. He showed up consistently. Slowly, the walls began to crack. Helping others forced Nathaniel to confront parts of himself he had not fully healed. But instead of breaking him, it strengthened his resolve. With greater responsibility came exhaustion. Nathaniel worked long hours, balancing studies, community programs, and personal recovery. His mind grew tired, and the familiar signs of burnout appeared. Old thoughts whispered again: escape, numbness, relief. Nathaniel recognized the danger and acted quickly. He reduced his workload, sought professional help, and leaned on his support system. Choosing rest felt like failure at first. But he learned that sustainability was a form of discipline. Ignoring his limits had destroyed him once. He refused to repeat that mistake. Strength, he discovered, included knowing when to pause. A journalist reached out, requesting an interview about Nathaniel's work. The article would include his full story, everything. The thought terrified him. Nathaniel debated declining. Public exposure could reopen wounds, attract judgment, or threaten his progress. But hiding felt like a step backward. After much thought, he agreed, on one condition: the story would be told honestly, without glamour or pity. When the article was published, reactions were mixed. Some praised his courage. Others criticized him harshly. Nathaniel read everything and chose not to respond. For the first time, public opinion did not define him. Months later, Ethan graduated from the rehabilitation program. During the ceremony, he approached Nathaniel and thanked him publicly, acknowledging the impact of his patience and honesty. Nathaniel stood there, overwhelmed. In that moment, he understood the true meaning of success. It wasn't money, titles, or recognition, it was transformation. That night, Nathaniel sat alone, reflecting on his journey. The boy who once had everything had lost it all, only to discover something greater in the ruins. He smiled softly, knowing the road ahead would still have challenges, but he was no longer afraid. Despite all he had achieved, Nathaniel could not deny that the shadow of his past still followed him. Some nights, memories returned uninvited: the speed of fast money, the thrill, the danger. They came not as temptation, but as reminders of how thin the line was between control and collapse. He learned not to fight the memories, but to observe them. Dr. Allen had taught him that denial gave pain more power. Acceptance weakened it. So, Nathaniel sat with his thoughts, breathing through them, grounding himself in the present. There were days when he felt invincible, and others when he felt fragile. He stopped labeling either state as failure. Healing, he understood, was not the absence of struggle, but the ability to navigate it. In acknowledging his shadow, Nathaniel finally stopped being afraid of it. A crisis erupted within the non-profit when funds went missing. Suspicion spread quickly, and Nathaniel found himself at the center of the storm, not as a suspect, but as a leader expected to act decisively. Old fears resurfaced. Accusations. Investigations. The word fraud hovered in the air like a curse. Nathaniel felt his chest tighten as memories of his past threatened to overwhelm him. Instead of withdrawing, he leaned forward. He initiated a transparent audit and invited external oversight. He spoke openly to staff, acknowledging the discomfort while insisting on integrity. When the truth emerged that the issue was a clerical error, trust was restored. Nathaniel learned that leadership was not about escaping suspicion, but about facing it with clarity. One evening, Nathaniel received a message from his cousin, the same one who had once blamed him harshly. The message was simple: "I understand now. I am sorry." They met days later. The conversation was softer this time, filled with pauses and reflection. Pain was acknowledged without accusation. Silence spoke as loudly as words. Nathaniel realized forgiveness had quietly done its work. The anger that once lived in him had dissolved, replaced by understanding. The family bond, though altered, was no longer broken. As they parted, Nathaniel felt lighter. Some wounds, he learned, healed slowly, but they did heal. Graduation day arrived quietly. Nathaniel stood among others, holding a certificate he once believed he would never earn. There was no crowd cheering, no grand celebration, but his heart was full. He thought of his parents and imagined their smiles. Not pride in achievement, but pride in character. That mattered more. Later that evening, Nathaniel visited the learning center alone. He walked through the empty rooms, remembering his first day there, broken, uncertain, desperate. He was no longer that man. He was still healing, still learning, but he was whole in ways money could never provide. On a calm morning, Nathaniel sat outside watching the city wake up. The sounds of life, voices, engines, footsteps, felt grounding rather than overwhelming. He reflected on the journey that had shaped him: privilege, loss, rebellion, collapse, recovery. None of it was wasted. Each chapter had carved wisdom into his soul. Nathaniel accepted that his life would never be perfect. There would be difficult days, lingering scars, and moments of doubt. But there would also be purpose, connection, and peace. As the sun rose higher, Nathaniel stood and walked forward, no longer chasing who he used to be, but honoring who he had become. Nathaniel received an invitation that stirred emotions he thought were buried. His former university was hosting an alumni and community impact conference. They wanted him to attend, not as a student who failed, but as a guest speaker. Walking onto the campus again felt surreal. The building stood unchanged, but he was not the same man who had once left in shame. Memories flooded back, late night studying, dreams of success, and the day his world collapsed. As he stood before the audience, Nathaniel spoke calmly. He did not glorify his fall or exaggerate his rise. He told the truth plainly. Education, he said, was not just academic, it was emotional, moral, and psychological. When he finished, a young student approached him with tears in her eyes. "You gave me courage," she said. Nathaniel realized the circle was closing. That night, however, guilt returned unexpectedly. Nathaniel remembered people he had hurt during his darkest years, names he had tried to forget. Not all damage could be undone. He spent hours writing letters he never sent, acknowledging harm without seeking forgiveness. The process was painful but necessary. Healing, he learned, included accountability even when reconciliation was impossible. Instead of drowning in guilt, Nathaniel chose responsibility. He began funding counseling sessions anonymously for at-risk youth, not as repayment, but as redirection. Guilt no longer chained him, it guided him. A sudden episode hit without warning. Anxiety returned in waves, heavy and suffocating. Old fears whispered lies, that everything he built could still collapse. Nathaniel took time off. He did not hide it. He informed his team and sought professional help immediately. This time, there was no shame. Recovery was quicker than before, not because the pain was smaller, but because his response was wiser. He understood now that mental health required maintenance, not heroism. When he returned, stronger and clearer, his team respected him more, not less. Nathaniel launched a mentorship program named the Second Chance Initiative. It focused on young people from privileged backgrounds who had fallen into destructive paths, those often overlooked by society's sympathy. The program grew rapidly. Parents, educators, and counselors joined hands. Stories of recovery multiplied. Nathaniel watched quietly, humbled. His pain had become soil for something meaningful. His story no longer belonged only to him. Legacy, he realized, was not inheritance, it was impact. For the first time in years, Nathaniel allowed himself emotional closeness. He met Grace, a counselor working with the initiative. Their connection was slow, honest, and grounded. Nathaniel was transparent about his past. Grace listened without fear or fascination. She saw him clearly, and stayed. Their relationship taught Nathaniel something new: love did not have to be dramatic to be deep. Stability was not boring, it was healing. For once, his heart rested instead of racing. A massive financial opportunity arrived, completely legal, but ethically questionable. It promised fast expansion and influence. Old instinct stirred. The desire to move quickly, to win aggressively, to dominate. Nathaniel paused. He consulted mentors, reflected deeply, and declined the offer. Growth at the cost of integrity was not growth at all. This time, there was no struggle afterward. The decision felt clean. He knew then that the old Nathaniel no longer rode him. On his birthday, Nathaniel returned to the old house where he grew up. It was empty now, weathered by time. He sat on the steps and spoke aloud to the boy he used to be. He forgave him. He thanked him for surviving. Tears came, but they were gentle. Some goodbyes, he realized, were meant to be peaceful. Schools began using Nathaniel's journey as part of mental health and ethics discussions. Not as a cautionary tale alone, but as proof of recovery. Nathaniel attended one session quietly, listening as students discussed his life without knowing he was there. He smiled. His story had grown beyond him. That was enough. Life settled into routine, work, love, service, rest. No chaos. No extremes. Nathaniel learned to cherish ordinary days. Healing had taught him that peace was not loud, it was consistent. He no longer chased happiness. He practiced gratitude. And it stayed. Nathaniel stood at the learning center one evening, watching the sunset. He thought about everything he had been: rich son, broken boy, fallen man, healed soul. He smiled. He was no longer defined by wealth, failure, or redemption alone. He was defined by choice. The golden sun had fallen, but what rose was something stronger than gold. A man who survived himself. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel.